church. Jacob's situation in his family was not good. He showed favoritism to Rachel over Leah. He created a rift between his own sons because of his wives. These brothers learned to hate one another because Jacob showed favoritism, not just to the wives, but also to the sons. And Jacob lost influence over his sons. His sons became violent and deceptive. The oldest, Reuben, tried to gain control over the family. The family of the patriarch was in shambles if you looked at it from the outside. Things looked really bad. But the amazing thing of it is that God's covenantal promises were still there. And God is in control of all situations. Esau had left Canaan and gave it essentially to Jacob. God had given Jacob many sons. God protected Jacob from himself and from others, thereby fulfilling the promises that he had made. This is the situation that we are in, and this begins Jacob's Toledot, the last in Genesis. Remember, Genesis is broken up to Toledots, generations. And Isaac's focused heavily on Jacob, and Jacob's will focus heavily on Joseph. There are many similarities between Jacob's Toledot and Isaac's Toledot. Here's a few of them. Each was preceded by the brothers' shorter Toledot. Isaac's was preceded by Ishmael's. Jacob's was preceded by Esau's. Both focus early on a promise made by God. Jacob would rule over Esau. The older would serve the younger. And here, as we've just read, God promised through a dream Joseph that he would rule over his brothers. Both promises looked to be in doubt throughout the situation until God intervened. Favoritism was a big part of the parents' life with their siblings. Abraham loved Isaac more. Jacob loved Joseph more. Jacob deceived Isaac using Esau's clothes. Jacob's brothers will deceive Jacob by using Joseph's clothes. Esau sought to kill Jacob. Joseph's brothers seek to kill him. Jacob was forced to flee to a different land. Joseph will be forced to flee to a different land. Again, Isaac's Toledot focused mostly on his son Jacob, and Jacob's Toledot will focus mostly on his son Joseph. And as we go through Genesis, a major focus, and one that will continue that we will see, is the interplay between God's sovereignty and human free will. These are topics that people love to debate, as if one is true and the other isn't. That is not the case. Joseph and his brothers will act freely. They have their own intentions. They do what they want to do, but God is sovereign over all that happens. The brothers will choose to sell Joseph into slavery, but it was God who sent Joseph to Egypt, and he did this to save his family from the famine and to put the Israelites in the place where they would become slaves, fulfilling the promise to Abraham. We have the free will actions of Joseph's brothers, and we have the sovereignty of God. How God's sovereignty and human free will work together, we will not be able to understand this side of eternity, if ever. We may never be able to understand how God works in this way. We think of things in a linear, right? We think of things as an approximate cause. This caused this. God does not work that way. That is not who God is. He is not bound by anything linear. He is omni-chronos. He is across all times. But somehow God uses people's actions to accomplish his purpose. And we will see a lot of this happening throughout the rest of Genesis. just like we have already seen so far. So the rest of Genesis will focus heavily on Joseph. More about Joseph than anybody. He is equal, if not more than Abraham. And we will see major growth in Joseph, in the boy that he is now, to the man that he will become. Verse 2 tells us that Joseph was 17 years old. He is young and he is immature. He lacks discernment. He lacks wisdom. He's a bit boastful. Although as we go through Joseph's life, he has no lapses of faith. There are no times like we saw with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob where they lacked faith and did things their own way. That does not happen with Joseph. This does not mean that he was sinless. He is not sinless. But unlike Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, there is no recorded lapse of faith. Joseph did not receive any special revelation from God. He received these dreams that we just read about, but the dreams are a little bit different than what the other patriarchs received. They received God speaking to them. Even in dreams, God spoke to them. Joseph does not have any direct dialogue with God, where God speaks to him. Joseph's life is based on what he knew of God, what he learned from Jacob, what he learned from his experiences. He knew who God was, and his life will reflect it. So we get to verse 2. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. The word boy there has the idea of helper. He's an assistant. They are leading the way. They are the ones who are in charge, and Joseph, the boy, is there to help. They're the experienced ones. He is not. They're the ones who have done this before. He is there to help them, maybe learn from them, understand what's going on. The word boy isn't just an age. It's his status at this point in shepherding the flock. He is their assistant shepherd. And this becomes very important in a few verses. The brothers with him were Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher, the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah. Now remember, there's already animosity from the brothers toward Joseph. They already didn't like him. They didn't like that their mothers were not favored, that Joseph's mother was favored. He was spoiled. They didn't like him. And so the patriarch's family has been plagued. From Abraham, Isaac, and now Jacob, they have been plagued by the parents showing favoritism. And the generational sin has been passed on to Jacob. And so Joseph, the helper, the assistant, brings a bad report. Now, it's possible, as we will see later on, that Jacob actually sent Joseph to check on his brothers, to see how they were doing and to bring back a report. We aren't told in this time. Whatever the situation, he brought a bad report. Joseph was a tattletale. But he didn't lie. Now, I say tattletale, not meaning that he did something wrong, but see it from the brother's perspective. Here's daddy's favorite. He's coming out. He's here to check on us. He's here to help us. And then he doesn't even know what he's doing, and he brings a bad report to daddy. The spoiled little boy is telling on his big brothers. He gets them into more trouble. Now, compounded in this is the fact that Jacob wasn't content with Joseph being his favorite. He wanted to make sure that everybody knew, that there was a continual reminder that Joseph was his favorite. And so Jacob gave him a special coat. The word in Hebrew actually doesn't mean multicolored coat. Long story. That's how it was translated into the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint. That's how then it was translated into the Vulgate, which is the Latin translation, which is what was used in King James, which is created the history of Joseph's the Technicolor dream coat. But it does mean something special. The idea is a coat of royalty. The only other time that this word is used in the Old Testament, which is why it's a little bit difficult to translate, is when it was describing what King David's virgin daughters wore. There's something royal about this coat. It had long sleeves, which a lot of coats back then didn't have long sleeves. So if they translated it, Jacob gave him a long-sleeved coat, all of us would say, and. But it's not a coat for working. It's not a coat for manual labor. It's a coat of royalty. And by giving this robe to Joseph, Jacob exalted him over his brothers. Jacob gave Joseph a visible reminder. Jacob gave his brothers, Joseph's brothers, a visible reminder of Joseph's status. Now remember, Joseph was Jacob's 11th son. He was not close to being the oldest. But he was the oldest of Rachel, his favorite wife. And Reuben, the oldest son, lost his place by what he did with Bilhah. So think about the situation, right? Because the situation is important. Joseph was already the favorite. There was already animosity toward him. He brought a bad report about his brothers to their father. Then Jacob gives Joseph a special robe showing his place as the favorite son, a constant reminder of his status and theirs. They hated Joseph and they could not even speak peacefully to him. They could not say anything nice to or about Joseph. They hated him. In the Hebrew, it actually says, and his brothers saw that him their father loved. Not as we speak in English, and their brothers saw that Jacob loved him more. It's that their father loved more. And by placing him in front is the emphasis on Joseph and his status. It's not that Jacob loved him more, it's that him Jacob loved more. He, Joseph, they were jealous. He was daddy's favorite, and Joseph was also more righteous than they. And they hated him to the point where they couldn't even be civil with him. In the midst of all this, Joseph has a dream. See in this dream and what he does with it, Joseph's lack of humility, his immaturity, and his inability to read the room. Right? We just went through the background. Joseph is not appreciated by his brothers because he is exalted above them. Remember, Joseph is 17. Here's this dream, verses 5 to 7. Now Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf. Over and over again, behold, this is the attention grabber. Listen to this. I had this dream, and listen to this. My sheaf rose above yours. And then listen to this. Yours bowed down to mine. His brothers knew immediately what had happened, what the dream meant. I mean, Joseph told this dream to his brothers. You feel like saying, what were you thinking? Like we know that as we get older, especially, we understand this. There are times, and I'm still learning, but there are times where we say things, and then we think, why did I just say that? I should have kept that to myself. But we do it anyway. And then we learn, or we do it again and again. But we learn that we know as we get older there are some things that shouldn't be said. Even if they're true, they shouldn't be said. This was one of those moments. Joseph should have kept this to himself. He was already hated by his brothers. He was already daddy's favorite. His brothers immediately understood what the dream meant. Verse 8, his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. The double, you see, rule and reign. Are you going to reign over us? Are you going to rule over us? It shows the level of disdain. The level that they really think, Joseph, do you really think you're going to reign? Do you really think you're going to rule? And they hated him for the dream and because he told it to them. Joseph should have learned in that moment. But he had another dream. Verse 9, he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream. You liked the last one so much, let me tell you about my next one. I had another one. Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to them, "What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you?" And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. He shared it again, and Jacob rebuked him. Jacob didn't rebuke him for the dream. You don't control your dreams. Jacob rebuked Joseph for sharing the dream. Joseph, again, there are things that you shouldn't share. There are things that God maybe even communicates to you that is not for don't brag about what God is doing. Don't brag to your brothers about what God has communicated to you. Jacob understood God communicated in dreams, although God communicated more directly to Jacob by actually speaking to him. But Jacob was intrigued. He kept the saying in mind. How would this dream be fulfilled was unknown, but Jacob was interested. He kept the saying in mind. "Joseph, you should have been quiet, but I'm very interested in seeing what God's going to do through what you just said, through this dream." Now notice he says, "Shall your mother and I bow down to you?" Remember that Rachel is dead. Joseph's mother is not around. She is not in a place to bow down. More than likely, this refers to Bilhah, Rachel's servant, who would have taken her place in the motherly role of Joseph. Shall those over you, Joseph, bow down? Again, the rebuke by Jacob was not for the dream itself, but for Joseph sharing it. With both dreams, Joseph would have done quite well to remain silent. He would have done well to just keep it to himself. But in this, we see a bit of pride and arrogance. At best, we see extreme naivety. At best, why in the world, Jacob or Joseph, did you think that this would make things better? Did you think that this would help at all? No, just be quiet. But it added fuel to the already scorching hot fire of disdain that his brothers had toward him. Now, as we have seen throughout Genesis, and we will continue to see, in some ways even more so, is the theme of redemption that is throughout Genesis. Genesis is the book of beginnings, but it is also a book of redemption. And we see that going back to Genesis 3:15, the promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. God promised Adam and Eve that what they just did by eating of the fruit, God would make it better. He would fix it. He would return things back to the way they were. He would crush the serpent's head. And these 11 verses that we just read are a part of a much larger narrative going through all of Genesis 37 and really through the rest of the book. But these verses set the foundation and the tension that we will see throughout the rest of Genesis. Joseph is going to reign, but there's going to be a lot that happens between that point and now. And there will become times, if we don't know the end of the story, there will be times where we look back at these promises to Joseph and we say, it can't be fulfilled. God, your promise to Joseph cannot be fulfilled because of his current situation. It is hopeless. That's the God we serve. There is no hopeless situation when you are at the throne of God. There is no hopeless situation when you remember the cross of Christ and the fact that his grave was empty. God was going to do some amazing things in and through Joseph. But Joseph wasn't ready. Do you ever pause and think, God, I want you to use me in amazing ways? God, why aren't you doing things? You ever stop and think, maybe I'm not yet ready? I mean, I doubt it, because I remember being in that position and saying, God, what are you doing? God, why aren't you moving? And as I look back at my life, I learned times where I needed to be humbled. I needed to rest in him. I needed to trust in him. I needed to realize who I am and who he is. And it wasn't until that, not that it's already accomplished, I assure you. If you would like to have conversations about how it's still being worked out in my life, I'm happy to have it with you. But it's in those times where we say, God, why aren't you doing more? God is teaching us lessons. He's teaching us to rest. He is teaching us humility. He is teaching us to trust. He is teaching us all kinds of things. He, in many ways, has to break us down before he can then build us up. And by building us up, what it means is that we are wholly reliant upon him. We are not doing it in our own strength. We are not doing it in our own ability. We have learned and are learning to rest and trust in him. Joseph had a lot of growing up to do before he would be in a position to be used by God. Matthew 23, 11 and 12, Jesus said, "The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." Here's a little secret. People aren't born humble. You're probably aware of that. People are not born humble. God has to work in our lives, and typically, a person has to go through difficult times in life, go through failures, embarrassments, mistakes, and then they come out with humility because they realize their own position. They realize who they are. I remember conversations I had with a friend. Another friend had actually committed adultery, and my one friend said, I can't believe that he would ever do that. Like, on one level, yeah, I get that. But on another level, we are all sinners in need of a Savior. Like, no sin should surprise anybody because we are all sinners in need of a Savior. And when we realize our own depravity, then nothing will surprise us. Then we won't condemn others who fall. Think about King David. King David, the one who committed adultery and then murder, was a man after God's own heart. Why? Because he repented. He learned his depravity and who he was and who God is. Joseph was proud. He was the favorite. And he was not the favorite as in the typical sibling, your dad's favorite, your mom's favorite sort of way. He was actually the favorite. And Jacob made sure that everybody knew. Joseph's dreams furthered his pride. And we see this in the fact that he told his brothers. So God used, as we look at this, God used Jacob's sin of favoring Joseph, Joseph's bragging, and the brothers' sin of hating him for his purpose. See, the amazing thing about God, he takes what we consider to be horrible failures, horrible situations, and he uses them to shape us and those around us. And he makes us into people who reflect him more. And as we reflect him more, we further his glory. Not that he needs us, but he chooses to use us to bring people to him. Joseph, between now and the end of Genesis, will be changed. And this is why James wrote in James 1, 2, and 4, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." Another way of saying this is count it all joy when you go through difficult circumstances, whether self-inflicted or not, because you know that through it you will learn who God is and you will begin to trust him in all circumstances. It's when we are in that place that we are used by God in the most amazing ways. When we understand this, we step out in faith because we trust him. It's in this place, going through the trials of life, after we make it through, it's there that we learn to be content in all circumstances, knowing that God is always working. We have talked a lot about sanctification, specifically through Jacob's life and the process that it is. It's a journey that is filled with trials and temptations. Sometimes we give in to temptations. Sometimes we say or share things that we shouldn't share or say. Sometimes those things damage relationships, often unintentionally. But our ability to move on is knowing that God is at work in our lives. And Joseph later learned humility. And I am certain that this, what we just read, played a part in his sanctification. There's a famous quote that's attributed to a number of people, possibly because they all said it. Albert Einstein, Thomas Edison, Teddy Roosevelt. "Show me a man who has never made a mistake, and I will show you a man who has never tried anything." See, this is true in many aspects of life. This is true in the Christian walk. This is true in work and daily life. But we can go through life afraid to say things, do things, or try things. But if we do that, we will never learn to grow. God takes our failures and he teaches us from them. This does not mean go and sin willy-nilly, and then you'll learn. That's not what this means. But this does mean that in our sinful state, we will make mistakes, and that's okay. One, we are forgiven because of what Jesus did. Because he died. Because he lived the life that we cannot live. He died to the death that we deserve to die, and then he walked out of the grave. It's also how we learn and grow. And God uses these moments to teach us that relying on ourselves is not good. Rest in him. Trust in him. See, the beauty is that he forgives us. That he will use these times to teach us. And he will make our lights brighter and brighter as we reflect him more and more. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your path straight. Joseph had to learn to not trust in himself, to not try to get there himself. This is what Joseph would learn, and this is what we all need to learn. And he is gracious and he is kind enough to teach us.